Imagine for a moment the absolute worst-case scenario. It's not a political coup. It's not an invasion by a rival empire looking to take your factories or your resources. What we're talking about is something far more primal, far more terrifying. This is an enemy that doesn't care about your flag, your belief system, or the advanced technology you hold in your hands. They just see one thing when they look at you and your entire civilization calories. They see fuel. Hey guys, welcome back! You tuned in because you want the big story, and this is the biggest, grimmest war the galaxy has ever known. Today, we are diving deep into the Tyrannic Wars, the endless, terrifying struggle against what the Imperium of Man calls the Great Devourer. This is the kind of enemy that war stories are made of, except nobody survives to tell the tale. They are an enigma, these Tyranids, creatures born from the cold, deep darkness that exists between galaxies. Think about that for a second. They aren't from a nearby star system. They are extragalactic invaders who traveled through an unimaginable void just to get here. We don't know their origins. We don't know their ultimate goal. But we know the evidence of their passage. It's always the same, a trail of lifeless worlds, stripped of all organic matter. The singular, monstrous purpose that drives this entire race is consumption. They aren't motivated by our puny human notions like fear, territorial gain, or power. They just want to feed, and that ever-present hunger guides them in an unending crusade across the stars. They are the universe's apex predator, designed from the cellular level up to hunt, consume, and recycle. There can be no negotiation with this species. There is no truce or surrender that they will honor. They are simply here to consume it all. And when we say, consume it all, we mean everything. It doesn't matter if the flesh is alive or dead. It doesn't matter if a planet's population is loyal to the Emperor, or if they've sold their souls to the dark gods of chaos. To the Great Devourer, it's all the same, indistinguishable to them. Just biomass, just fuel. And they will get that fuel at any cost, even if it requires a galactic-scale massacre. The horror is existential in its totality. This isn't like fighting orcs, where you beat them and they retreat, or fighting chaos, where you cleanse the corruption. When the Tyranids conquer a planet, they don't leave garrisons or build monuments. They leave behind a desolate, barren rock. They consume the people, the plants, the animals, the atmosphere, even the bacteria, scraping the world clean until not even the essential minerals are left in the crust. In the grim, dark future of the Imperium, this fate is so unspeakably awful that sometimes the only thing a military commander can do is declare exterminatus. The complete destruction of a world, wiping out all life with orbital weapons, just to deny the Great Devourer its monstrous meal. When you have to destroy a world just to save it from being eaten, you know you are fighting something truly alien. But the sheer hunger is only part of the terror. The way they fight, the way they invade, is terrifyingly efficient because the Tyranid fleets aren't just transports carrying warriors. They are warriors in their own right, living organisms that consume and repurpose everything they encounter. Every single organism in the fleet, from the smallest ground feeder to the colossal, city-sized bioships, is perfectly designed for its role, a bio-constructed horror. And here is where the sci-fi horror hits its peak. They are constantly getting better. Unlike natural evolution, which takes millennia to sort things out, the Tyranids evolve with alarming, real-time speed. They assimilate the genetic strengths and traits of their prey and instantly weave them into their own biological arsenal. Their genetic makeup is described as being as malleable as clay in the hands of the hive mind. If you throw a new weapon or a new tactic at them in one battle, they will already have birthed a counter-creature specifically designed to defeat it in the next one. They are winning the biological arms race of the galaxy, turning our own strengths against us. The massive fleets they travel in, known as Hive Fleets, aren't just collections of ships. They are a cascade of destruction that can stretch across entire sectors and centuries. And the sheer, unfathomable number of them begs the question: how many other planets, how many entire star-spanning empires, or even whole galaxies have they already turned into building material for their untold hordes before they decided that the Milky Way was next on the menu? They arrived in our galaxy drawn by the massive, concentrated psychic energy signals we generate, specifically the psychic signature of the Emperor of Mankind, known as the Astronomicon, which acts like a massive cosmic dinner bell for these extra-galactic predators. But before the first ship even shows up, the terror has already begun, thanks to the vast, singular collective consciousness that directs them, the hive mind. That will be the focus of our next section, but for now, just remember this chilling truth about the Tyranids: their life cycle is the unending war. They don't want to stop until nothing is left but the empty, dead rock of a devoured galaxy. And this is the fight that defined the future of mankind. We just talked about the Tyranids' insatiable hunger, but now we need to talk about the truly scary part, the brain that guides that hunger. To understand why this enemy is so terrifying, you have to realize they aren't just a horde of giant bugs. They are a single, coordinated entity with a conscious will. We call it the hive mind. Forget every sci-fi movie you've seen where the aliens have a big central brain or one queen they protect. This is something else entirely. Imagine your own body. You are made of trillions of tiny individual cells, right? Those cells have no individual consciousness. They don't think about going to work or making dinner. They just perform their function, perfectly synchronized, to serve the whole. The hive mind is like the consciousness of a god, forged from the collective psychic presence of untold billions of creatures. Every single Tyranid organism, the tiny ones, the medium ones, the city-sized ships, is nothing more than a cell in the body of this incomprehensibly vast, galaxy-spanning intelligence. It is a massive, nigh-omniscient intellect, focused entirely on two primal imperatives: to devour and to evolve. The way this command structure works is ingenious, terrifyingly efficient, and utterly non-negotiable. The will of the hive mind flows through a biological internet, a psychic web called the synaptic network. This network is powered by larger, more intelligent creatures known as synapse creatures, the hive tyrants, the Tyranid warriors, and the specialized psychic bioforms like the zoanthropes. You can think of these creatures as living psychic routers or signal towers, broadcasting the iron will of the hive mind to all the lesser bugs around them. They are the generals, the conductors, and the nerve endings for the collective consciousness. This is the key difference between a Tyranid invasion and, say, a mindless wave of orcs. Every single move on the battlefield, every scything claw, every biological weapon fired, is perfectly coordinated in real time. The hive mind is constantly micromanaging billions of individuals, making its army move with the precision of a trained assassin, even when fielding the numbers of a maddened, unending mob. It's the ultimate combination of speed, strategy, and overwhelming force. Every battlefield lesson, every successful defense the Imperium throws up, is instantly recorded, analyzed, and integrated into the Tyranid genetic blueprint, allowing them to evolve on a timescale that makes human evolution look like a sloth crawling uphill. They literally birth new strains of creatures designed specifically to counter our latest weapons or tactics in the very next battle. It is the ultimate biological arms race, and the bugs are winning. But here is where the Imperium finds its only real vulnerability: in the swarm. If that psychic connection is cut, the lesser creatures, the termagants and hormagaunts that flood the trenches, instantly lose their cohesion. The hive mind's will is what overrides their simple, animalistic instincts. Cut off from the synaptic network, the hordes that minutes before were an elite, coordinated army suddenly revert to a feral, almost bestial state. They panic. They attack each other. They scatter. This simple fact, the necessity of the synaptic network, is why Imperial commanders always prioritize targeting the synapse creatures, the big leaders that act as the connection points. Knock out the router, and the cells, become nothing more than starving, confused beasts, ready to be mopped up. Now we have to talk about the most terrifying part of their existence, the shadow in the warp. This isn't just a physical invasion, this is a psychic one. The collective consciousness of the hive mind is so vast, so incredibly powerful that it generates an immense, pervasive psychic disturbance that radiates out from the hive fleet for light years. Think of it as a massive, cosmic wall of mental static, a colossal bubble of bad juju that envelopes entire star systems before the first enemy bioship even shows up. For the Imperium, this shadow is not a metaphor, it's a strategic doomsday device. The Imperium of Man relies entirely on psychic communication to hold its million worlds together. We're talking about astropaths, the telepaths who transmit critical messages, warnings, troop deployment orders, calls for help, across the massive gulfs of space. The shadow in the warp makes this utterly impossible. It's a complete communications blackout. When a hive fleet is coming, the doomed worlds suddenly go dark, cut off from the rest of the galaxy, unable to send a single distress signal or receive even the smallest promise of reinforcement. The first stage of the war is won by isolation, leaving the prey paralyzed, confused, and alone. And it gets worse. This psychic distortion doesn't just cut off communication, it fundamentally poisons the very fabric of space used for interstellar travel, known as the warp. Human ships navigate the stars by slipping into this dimension, guided by the psychic beacon of the Emperor, the Astronomicon. The hive mind's shadow makes warp travel near the fleet's position either impossible or wildly unpredictable, throwing ships off course or trapping them in the horrors of the Imperium. The Great Devourer doesn't need to engage in a traditional naval battle with every ship. The shadow acts as an invisible, galaxy-spanning naval blockade, preventing reinforcements from ever reaching the sector. Finally, the psychological toll is immense. The shadow in the warp isn't just external static, it penetrates the minds of every living creature nearby, acting as pure psychological warfare. For an average person, it manifests as a chilling, inescapable, primal dread, a deep-seated sense of malaise and fear that never lifts, driving them to despair and confusion. But for the Imperium's own psychers, the mentalists and sorcerers who wield psychic powers, the effect is catastrophic. The horror of the hive mind's collective consciousness is magnified tenfold, turning their own abilities against them and driving them quickly into incurable insanity or a violent, messy death. Their psychic minds are simply overloaded by the sheer alien malice of the hive mind. It's an invisible wave of despair that wins the fight before the first claw is even deployed, stripping the defenders of their communication, their transportation, and their spiritual strength. That, my friends, is the hive mind, the ultimate strategist, the ultimate bioengineer, and the ultimate nightmare. We just talked about the nightmare that is the hive mind, this massive, single, hungry consciousness that drives the Tyranids. But here's the most heartbreaking, frustrating part of the whole story. The biggest apocalypse the galaxy has ever known, the one that threatens to wipe out all life. The Imperium of Man, the supposed protector of billions, totally missed the warning signs. They missed them for decades. They ignored them for centuries. They were so consumed by their own political squabbles and endless, internal battles that they treated the greatest existential threat of all time like a leaky faucet in the basement. An annoying problem that was too far away to deal with right now. Think about the sheer size of the Imperium. It's an empire of approximately 1 million worlds, spread across the entire Milky Way galaxy. It's impossible to police every corner, especially when you are constantly fighting the equivalent of 100 world wars simultaneously against orcs, chaos, and everything in between. The central government, the High Lords of Terror, had 1 million urgent problems on their desk every single day. So when the first reports started trickling in from the distant, forgotten edges of the galaxy, the eastern fringe, they were just filed away. This fatal oversight began with something small, insidious, and utterly human. It started with the Genestealer cults. These weren't alien armies landing in shining ships. This was internal subversion. The Genestealer cults are terrifying because they don't look like an enemy at first. They hide in plain sight deep within human society. Imagine your neighbor, your local governor, the maintenance crew in your factory. They are secretly worshipping alien gods and following a hypnotic, heretical dogma, waiting for the signal to rise up. The Genestealers themselves are the vanguard invaders of the Hive Fleet, sent in ahead of the main swarm. Their whole mission is to destabilize and weaken a world from the inside out, turning its loyal population into sleeper agents and its resources into preparation for the feast. The signs were everywhere in the eastern regions: strange new religious movements, loyal imperial rulers suddenly overthrown, populations plunging into the worship of abominable idols. But what did the Imperium see? Heresy, civil unrest, another planetary governor getting too ambitious. They didn't see the silent genetic clock ticking beneath the planet's surface, counting down to 0 hour. They sent a few low-level bureaucrats or a detachment of Imperial Guard to deal with the unrest, never realizing they were fighting the prelude to a galactic genocide. The truth is, the Imperium was so terrified of its own internal corruption, chaos cults and human rebellion, that it was completely unprepared to recognize a truly alien infiltration hiding in the same shadows. That was the first red flag, quietly poisoning the well. The second red flag was even more disturbing for anyone who understood the universe, yet it was dismissed as insignificant. This was the strange, slow-growing anomaly in the warp, the shadow that resembled a shadow. As we discussed, the hive mind is so huge, its psychic presence throws up a massive wall of static that disrupts space travel and communication. Well, this static didn't just appear fully formed one day. It started small. It was literally described as an insignificant spot in the warp that was slowly, inexorably growing. Picture it like this: if the entire galaxy is a pristine white sheet of paper, this psychic shadow was like a single, dark drop of ink that had landed on the edge, slowly, quietly blooming outward. System after system began to disappear behind this shadow, cloaked from the outside world. For a government that relies entirely on telepathic relays and FTL travel, this should have been a galaxy-wide emergency alert. A communications blackout means no trade, no defense, no help. But again, the geography saved the complacent. This ink drop was spreading out at the very edge of the galaxy. To the comfortable, powerful worlds near Holy Terror, those distant systems were expendable, or at least far too remote to warrant shifting entire battle fleets or diverting precious resources. Who cares if a couple of light beacons go dark way out in the void? It must be some local warp storm, or maybe those pesky pirates finally got organized. Nobody cared about its existence at that moment. For a long time, a terrifyingly long time, the status quo remained. The anomaly grew, swallowing more systems, isolating more people, and turning more planets into potential staging grounds for the bugs. The situation could not remain like this indefinitely, but human bureaucracy, being what it is, tried its best to ignore it anyway. It took the sheer scale of the disaster to finally draw bureaucratic attention. The panic reports and the disappearance of signals eventually reached a critical mass. It wasn't one world screaming for help. It was hundreds of worlds simply ceasing to exist on the charts. Silence replaced panic, and that silence was too loud to ignore any longer. So the central government finally reacted, but not with a massive, coordinated military response. They sent a single man, an investigator. That man was the young Inquisitor Kryptman. Kryptman was assigned to the region to figure out why an entire sector had suddenly gone dark. It was meant to be a simple, routine assignment, a clean-up job to re-establish communications, and maybe purge a few local heretics. He didn't know at the time that he was walking into the most important investigation of his life. He had no idea that he would find his life's entire purpose in this distant, dark corner of the eastern fringe. But he was about to find something far worse than rebels or heretics. He was about to find bare, dead rock where entire civilizations once thrived. This chilling discovery, this realization that something utterly new and impossibly hungry was loose in the galaxy, would consume Kryptman entirely, and his eventual response would brand him a genocidal maniac to some, and the savior of the Imperium to others. But before any of that, the Devourer had to land its first major, unforgettable punch. And that punch landed right on a small, doomed outpost, Tyran Prime. It all started with an insignificant spot. Remember how we talked about that little drop of ink? That slow-growing psychic shadow at the edge of the galaxy? Well, that quiet creep quickly escalated into the sound of grinding teeth. The Imperium was too busy fighting itself to notice the small worlds that were just disappearing. And that brings us to the first major documented contact, the moment the galaxy was forced to recognize the horror, the First Tyrannic War. This terrifying conflict officially kicked off around the year 745 of the 42nd millennium, and the whole species gets its name, Tyranids, in grim honor of the very first imperial world that was completely devoured and documented, the Tyran Prime outpost. It's a sad kind of legacy, right? Naming the nightmare after the place where the nightmare finally opened its eyes. But here's a critical piece of the puzzle that often gets missed. The fleet that arrived first wasn't the biggest or strongest. This colossal wave, later named Hive Fleet Behemoth for its overwhelming, brutish size, was actually starving. They had spent an unknown amount of time traveling the intergalactic void, and they were exhausted by the long, deep flight between galaxies. So what did they do? They didn't immediately hit the biggest, toughest worlds. For a while, researchers on Tyran Prime had been watching strange phenomena. Planets in nearby systems that had once been teeming with life were suddenly turning into lifeless husks. Not even a microbe could be found on their surface. These were soft targets, worlds that had no intelligent life and were not expected to offer much resistance. The Tyranids were using these unfortunate places as massive, stellar gas stations. They would consume the organic material, replenish their strength, and recycle that devoured prey into new ranks of warriors with those distinctive shiny chitinous shells and razor-sharp claws. They were literally building their army piece by piece, fueling the engine of war with the remains of forgotten worlds, before they finally turned their eyes toward the fattest prey in the system, the Tyran Prime outpost. The fact that the Imperial outpost had a chance to prepare at all was a stroke of pure, random luck, a terrifying moment of serendipity. A returning Imperial research vessel, beaten and battered, stumbled upon a vast cluster of unidentified entities on the edge of the system. On closer inspection, these turned out to be fields of horrific biological mines. The ship suffered heavy damage, but managed to punch through the barrier, delivering a dire warning to the outpost. The defenders had a couple of days to prepare for the inevitable. Now, the Tyran Prime outpost wasn't some flimsy shed in the desert. It was a serious base nestled among an ancient chain of volcanic islands, commanded by Varric Magos of the Adeptus Mechanicus. This guy wasn't new to war. The fortress was ready for anything, from chaos cultists to the known alien enemies of the Imperium. The Imperial Guard, the Astra Militarum, were on the ground, supported by fighter squadrons and, most importantly, 4 huge orbital defense lasers buried deep within massive ceramite mines. These were centuries-old defenses, protected by void shields, artillery, and huge bunkers. If any world was ready to fight, it was this one. The battle began in orbit. The massive orbital lasers opened fire first, unleashing a storm of intense, concentrated fire against the arriving Tyranid bioships. For over an hour, the battle raged in the black sky. The fire was so intense, so relentless, that the cooling systems of the laser units began to glow white and dangerously overheat. The defenders pushed the enemy back again and again, and then something amazing happened. The Tyranids stopped their attack and retreated. Magos Varric, seeing this pause in the fighting, saw a huge opportunity. He quickly concluded that his intense fire had routed the enemy, considering it a great success. He made a fatal decision. He ordered his small, brave fleet to pursue the retreating ships to finish them off. This was the first time the hive mind showed its chilling tactical intelligence. It was a feint. It was a calculated trap. The Imperial ships broke through a cloud of spores, hoping to see the enemy in full flight, only to find that of the thousands of bioships in the enemy fleet, no more than a dozen had actually been destroyed. The retreat was merely a maneuver to lure the Imperial defenders out from under the protection of their planetary defense guns. The Hive fleet immediately began attacking the now doomed ships with redoubled, furious force. Despite the crew's heroic resistance, the ships were either destroyed by volleys of biocannons or brutally cleansed of life by Tyranid boarding action. In a matter of minutes, the defense fleet was finished, and the true massive ground invasion began. The skies were immediately choked with spores, a horrifying organic rain meant to poison the world and disrupt the defenses. Imperial fighters trying to punch through started dropping as their engines failed, choked by the fungal atmosphere. On the ground, the defense was desperate. The open areas outside the fortresses became true killing fields. Wave after wave of Tyranids crashed into the Imperial lines. We're talking about the endless multitudes, Hormagaunts and Genestealers, expendable troops for the hive mind. The defenses held for a time, with artillery tearing bloody holes in the charging masses, but the sheer volume of the enemy was a force of nature. Then came the breaches. The Tyranids didn't rely on smart bombs or clever infiltration. They relied on overwhelming, literal brute strength. A colossal, heavily armored organism called a Carnifex, one of the Tyranids' Crusher Stampede beasts, literally rammed its massive bulk through the fortified wall, creating a yawning gap. Thousands of smaller Tyranid forms immediately poured into that breach like water rushing through a broken dam. Simultaneously, the flying forms, the gargoyles, attacked the northern defense laser. They didn't target the crew, they simply smothered the beam projectors with their own bodies, putting the weapon out of commission and leaving a massive hole in the Imperial wall of deadly fire. The collapse was slow, painful, and absolute. Defense lines were abandoned as they became impossible to hold. Even the most hardened guardsmen began to shake and panic. The last act of the tragedy unfolded in the main command bunker. The Tyranids, guided by the implacable will of the hive mind, finally found a way to overcome the sturdy walls. The adamantium gates fell, and a flood of creatures swarmed the complex. In his final moments, as his staff and the remaining guards fought a desperate battle with flamers, Magos Varek didn't panic. He described everything that had happened, his observations, and his desperate thoughts on the nature of the enemy. He uploaded this entire data codex, gambling that it would survive the apocalypse and be found by someone with sufficient competence to appreciate the vital value of this information. He was fighting a war for the future, sacrificing the last piece of intelligence he had. The planet was lost, it was stripped bare. And that is exactly what happened. About a year later, the very man we discussed earlier, Inquisitor Kryptman, arrived on the desolate rock, where once there had been vast shining oceans. Kryptman found only a bare consumed world, but he found the data codex. After studying the horrifying details of the invasion and the subsequent consumption, Kryptman understood the scale of the threat. This alien foe was unprecedented, a plague of biological destruction. He dedicated his life to fighting them, naming them the Tyranids in honor of the outpost that died to give the galaxy its first brutal lesson. Kryptman knew he had to warn the rest of the Imperium, and he had to warn them now. He tried to use his astropath, his telepathic communicator, to send a warning. But what we learned in Part 2 was already happening. The message was unable to get through the immense psychic disturbance in the warp caused by the freshly arrived Hive fleet. The shadow in the warp had already started its work, cutting off the Imperium's eyes and ears. Realizing he had no time to waste, Kryptman set a desperate, breakneck course for the nearest major Imperial domain, the prosperous and vital sector known as Ultramar. He knew that if this first Hive Fleet Behemoth broke through here, the amount of biomass they would gain would be catastrophic, securing their place as an unstoppable force. The First Tyrannic War was about to explode into a galaxy-defining conflict, and the man who named the bugs was now racing against them to save mankind. Inquisitor Kryptman, clutching the data codex from the dead world of Tyran Prime, knew the clock was ticking. He had discovered the most horrific species the galaxy had ever coughed up, and now he was in a desperate race against them. The problem was the hive mind's psychic static, that insidious shadow in the warp, had made interstellar communication impossible. Kryptman couldn't send a warning ahead. He had to physically outrun the Hive Fleet Behemoth, a force of unimaginable size, to save the Imperium's vital heartland. His target was Ultramar, the domain of the Ultramarines Space Marines, one of the most prosperous, heavily populated, and strategically crucial sectors in the entire galaxy. This wasn't just some backwater planet the Tyranids were heading toward. This was the last defensive line. If Behemoth managed to breach Ultramar, it would gain untold amounts of biomass, strengthening the Horde into an absolutely unstoppable, galaxy-killing monster. Ultramar was the final frontier, and if it fell, the Tyranids would be free to feast on the entire core of the human empire. Fortunately for mankind, Kryptman made it, delivering his dire warning to the legendary leader of the Ultramarines, Chapter Master Marnius Kalga. Now, Kalga is not just some soldier. He is one of the greatest military minds in the Imperium, a titan of defense, and the commander of the most rigorously organized military force in the galaxy. Crucially, unlike the distant bureaucrats on Holy Terror who dismissed Kryptman's earlier reports, Kalga took the message from the frantic, unknown Inquisitor seriously. He immediately ordered his home world, Macragge, to prepare for total war. Macragge was already one of the most perfectly fortified planets in existence, a masterpiece of Imperial engineering, but Kalga focused on creating fallback positions, specifically the mighty, ancient polar fortresses at the planet's northern and southern ends. He planned to hold the line on the ground, then retreat to these indestructible bastions and hold out until reinforcements could arrive from distant sectors. But before the ground war could start, there was the small matter of dealing with the Hive Fleet in orbit. Kalga knew Behemoth's fleet was vast, stretching for light years and containing thousands of living bioships. But he also knew that, initially, it lacked the raw, concentrated firepower of a traditional Imperial armada. So, Kalga cobbled together everything that could fight, not just the massive Ultramarines battle barges and heavy cruisers, but also lightly armed merchant vessels, privateers, and every escort ship he could requisition. His strategy was simple and terrifying. Reduce the Tyranid numbers as much as possible in the black void of space before the inevitable ground invasion began. When Hive Fleet Behemoth arrived, it was a terrifying sight, a black tide of organic ships moving with a singular purpose. The Imperial fleet met them with a massive storm of powerful, orderly, and incredibly disciplined fire. The Ultramarines fought with suicidal bravery, pushing the Tyranids back again and again, but the sheer, unending mass of the enemy was overwhelming. Imperial ships were crushed, battered, and scattered. It was at the height of this terrifying naval brawl that the most desperate act of the war took place, the sacrifice of the battleship Dominus Astra. With the Imperial line crumbling, the crew of this Emperor-class battleship, one of the largest and most powerful warships in the fleet, steered their crippled, wounded hulk right into the thickest concentration of the enemy and detonated the ship's warp engines. This wasn't just a big explosion, it ripped a temporary, localized rift in the fabric of space itself, a chaotic, localized black hole effect that defeated and scattered most of the Hive Fleet in orbit. This heroic, agonizing sacrifice bought the defenders on Macragge precious, vital time. It ensured that the hive mind could not simply overwhelm the planet from orbit. They had to win the war on the ground, centimeter by bloody centimeter. On the planet's surface, Kalga led the main task force, initially succeeding in slowing the relentless Tyranid advance. But the fighting was brutal, and the defense was a constant process of maneuvering and retreating, sacrificing ground to save lives. A major logistical blow came quickly. Genestealers, the subtle advance agents of the swarm, infiltrated the vital Sirocco starport, wiping out the defenders and destroying the majority of the supply and evacuation shuttles. Kalga was losing his ability to resupply and evacuate the wounded, cutting off options he would desperately need later. The chapter master knew he had to buy time for his forces to fall back to the polar fortresses, so he chose a freezing, exposed industrial complex called Cold Steel Ridge as his final, brutal stand against the initial swarm. This is where the enemy showed its true colors. Up to this point, Behemoth had been pure brute force, a relentless wave of red and blue chitin. But the hive mind, having learned from the defeat of its naval forces and the strong imperial defenses, had already analyzed the Ultramarines' tactics. It responded by unleashing its deadliest biological weapon, the Swarmlord. The Swarmlord is not just a hive tyrant, it's a terrifyingly intelligent creature, the physical manifestation of the hive mind's tactical will and battlefield knowledge. The moment it entered the battle, the entire look of the Tyranid swarm changed. The mad, frenzied frontal assaults were gone, replaced by a cunning, flexible, and utterly cold strategy. For instance, the Imperial forces had a powerful Baneblade tank, the Pride of Hera, guarding a key position on the left flank. Instead of attacking it directly, the Swarmlord ordered tunneling creatures called Raveners to erupt from the frozen ground nearby as a diversion, drawing Imperial counterattacks away from the tank. While the Ultramarines were busy trying to clear this snake-like living wall of Raveners, the hive mind directed a massive, targeted wave of Carnifexes, the heavily armored Crusher Stampede bioforms, to rip the now uncovered Pride of Hera to shreds. Kalga watched in horror as his previously indestructible defenses crumpled like a house of cards, realizing he was facing an enemy that was learning in real time. The battle climaxed in a ferocious duel. The Swarmlord, recognizing Kalga as the critical synapse creature of the Imperial defense, drove straight for him. Kalga, armed with his legendary gauntlets of Ultramar, stood his ground, but the fight was hopeless. The Swarmlord's speed and brutal strength proved too much, and the chapter master was cut down, grievously wounded, his body rent and torn by the alien's talons. This was the moment of ultimate despair. With their leader beaten and the line shattering, Kalga was saved only by the selfless sacrifice of his honor guard commander, Aloysius, who held back the Swarmlord long enough for the survivors to evacuate their wounded master via Thunderhawk gunships. Kalga survived, but he was temporarily out of the fight. With their supreme commander gone, the remaining Ultramarines and PDF forces fell back to the massive, fortress-like complexes at the poles of Macragge. The last hope for the planet rested entirely on the shoulders of the Ultramarines First Company, the chapter's elite, veteran warriors, who garrisoned the northern polar fortress. They knew they were doomed. They knew they were surrounded and cut off. But they had a mission by time for the newly assembled Imperial reinforcement fleets, which Kalga, recovered enough to take command, was now guiding from orbit to arrive. The ensuing battle was an epic, agonizing last stand. Wave after wave of Tyranids crashed against the fortress walls until the defenses failed completely. The First Company, surrounded and out of ammunition, fell back into the fortress's final catacombs. They fought to the last man, holding the line until the relief forces finally broke through the Tyranid remnants in orbit and landed on the devastated world. The sight that greeted the reinforcements was a grim testament to the Ultramarines' courage. The First Company was completely eradicated, wiped out to a single warrior, but their bodies were found back to back, surrounded by mountains of dead Xenos corpses, having held the line long enough for the rest of the planet to survive, and for the Imperium to declare a victory. Behemoth was destroyed, having been scattered and consumed by a combination of the Dominus Astra's sacrifice, Calga's cunning defense, and the unimaginable sacrifice of the First Company. Humanity had won the First Tyrannic War, but the cost was astronomical, and the hard-won lesson was chilling. The Great Devourer learns. It adapts. And if this first hungry wave almost wiped out the heart of the Imperium, what horror would the second wave bring? They had barely survived a single wave, and the galaxy's true nightmare was just getting started. The galaxy breathed a sigh of relief. The immense, brutish Hive Fleet Behemoth had been stopped at Macragge, scattered by the sacrifice of the Dominus Astra and defeated by the blood of the Ultramarines First Company. It was a win, but it was a Pyrrhic victory, meaning they had technically won. But the cost was so high it felt like a loss. They were left with one dead planet and one shattered, almost depopulated fortress world. But at least the Great Devourer was gone. For almost 200 years, the Imperium lived in a state of fragile peace, hoping that this nightmare species had been nothing more than a bizarre, one-off cosmic anomaly. They were dead wrong. Around 2 centuries after Behemoth's defeat, the first signs of trouble began to appear again. This time it wasn't a single, overwhelming tidal wave. The second major Tyranid invasion, Hive Fleet Kraken, arrived, and it was clear right away that the hive mind was much, much smarter now. If Behemoth was a giant, swinging club, brute force trying to smash through a wall, Kraken was 1,000 sharp, poisoned needles slipping through the cracks. The hive mind had learned the lesson of Macragge: a single, massive force is an easy target for a coordinated Imperial defense. Kraken changed its tactics completely, invading the galaxy not as one colossal wave, but as multiple smaller tentacles of a larger fleet. This was a brilliant move, a complete tactical pivot that made a unified, galaxy-wide Imperial defense nearly impossible to coordinate. Imagine a billion-mile-long monster with hundreds of arms, each striking at a different, isolated target simultaneously. This dispersed strategy meant that the Imperium could never mass enough force in one place to fight a decisive battle. Every world that was attacked had to fight its own war alone, often with no idea that the planet next door was also currently being consumed. And to make matters worse, the hive mind also significantly ramped up its psychic weapon, the shadow in the warp. Remember how that static cut off communication? For Kraken, the psychic static was even more intense, making it nearly impossible for the Imperium's telepaths to communicate and coordinate troop movements. Entire sectors were isolated almost instantly, losing communication in a matter of standard hours. It was a silent siege, trapping and paralyzing dozens of worlds before the Tyranids' ships even entered orbit. Only a handful of lucky survivors managed to escape these isolated sectors and tell the rest of humanity the horrific tales of skies choked by poisonous spores and monstrous creatures roaming the devastated, barren lands. This lack of communication was the key strategic advantage the hive mind had gained, ensuring the defenders remained confused and disorganized. This new sneaky approach resulted in chaos and a string of devastating losses. On the planet of Devlin, a major mining world, the attack was relentless. The heroic Wireless Space Marine chapter fought a desperate last stand, buying just enough time to allow millions of civilians to be evacuated on a huge fleet of transports. The planet itself was lost, and the Wireless company that defended it was completely destroyed to the last man, showing that even when the Imperium won by evacuating, the cost was total annihilation for the defenders. On another front, the Emperor's Scythe's Space Marine chapter suffered an even worse fate. Kraken hit their home world of Thur, and they were all but wiped out, suffering catastrophic losses and turning from a formidable military force into mere shards of their former glory. The Kraken invasion was thousands of light years wide, bypassing strong planets only to hit isolated ones, popping up like a galactic game of whack-a-mole. Imperial command was forced to make grim, impossible choices, focus all efforts and resources on saving the most important factory worlds and massive hive worlds, and leave countless secondary worlds to their fate. Abandon them entirely, or try to evacuate the population before the swarm arrived, knowing the ship sent would likely be destroyed. Every option meant certain death for millions, but it was a triage operation on a galactic scale. However, amidst the darkness, one beacon of hope shone through the battle for the hive world Hive. This industrial world was absolutely vital to the eastern region of the Imperium, and the Imperial command knew it had to be saved. By sheer coincidence, the Kraken's earlier, insidious vanguard, the Genestealer cults, had staged a major rebellion on Hive, which had actually tipped off the Imperial authorities that the planet was a high-value target. Because of this uprising, the Imperial forces determined the direction of the Tyranids' next major strike in advance, a luxury they hadn't had before. With this vital piece of intelligence, the Etcher system was thoroughly prepared for defense, with no expense or resource spared. And who did they bring in to organize the defenses? The veteran himself. Marneus Calgar of the Ultramarines, the man who had the most experience fighting the Tyranids after Macragge. The final battle saw the full might of the Ultramarines descend upon the planet. Kraken arrived with a renewed force, devouring several worlds on its path and growing its fleet exponentially on the biomass it consumed. The fight was brutal, starting with a massive second Genestealer uprising that cost many lives, proving that Kryptman's earlier assessment of the infiltration risk was entirely correct. But the meticulous preparation paid off. Calgar's defenses were literally built using the painful lessons of the Macragge defeat, and they shredded the Tyranid swarms with horrifying efficiency. The battle reached its climax when the Swarmlord, the supremely intelligent physical manifestation of the hive mind's tactical genius, showed up again, likely carrying the full combat data from the defeat at Macragge. But this time, Calgar was ready for the creature and faced it in a rematch. The fight was fierce, but this time, the heroic Imperial commander managed to defeat the Swarmlord, cutting off the clear chain of command and causing the remaining Tyranid forces to descend into disarray and defeat. The victory at Hive was the first true human win of the Second Tyrannic War, and it proved something vital: the Hive Fleet could be defeated without losing the entire planet or the entire defense force. It showed that with skillful command, proper preparation, and the unwavering will of a veteran warrior like Calgar, the Great Devourer was not an unstoppable force. It could bleed. But the Second Tyrannic War was far from over, and the other major tendril of Hive Fleet Kraken was about to bring the same horror to a completely different, ancient civilization on the other side of the sector. The battle for Hive might have been a win for humanity, proving that Hive Fleet Kraken could be beaten through cunning and preparation. But Kraken was not just one enemy, it was a 100-headed hydra, attacking everywhere at once. While one of its terrifying tentacles was busy being defeated by Marneus Calgar, another was moving towards a completely different target, a completely different civilization, and an even more profound tragedy. This new target was Craftworld Iyanden. Now, for those who don't know the Eldar, they are the ancient masters of the galaxy, a long-lived, highly advanced race of psychic space elves. They were once the undisputed rulers of the stars, until a catastrophic, self-inflicted cosmic tragedy known as the Fall shattered their empire. The survivors don't live on planets anymore. They live on colossal star-faring vessels called craftworlds, literally cities built out of living, psychoactive material that sail the void like massive, crystalline ships. Iyanden was special, though. It was once the largest and most populous of all the craftworlds, a city-ship that housed billions of souls and represented the absolute peak of their civilization's power and pride. But they were a dying race, dwindling for millennia, haunted by the ghost of their past sins. The few survivors live in terror that when they finally die, Their souls will be instantly consumed by the chaos god Slaanesh, the monstrous entity they accidentally created when their ancient empire imploded. To prevent this ultimate horror, every elder wears a tiny psychic gem called a waystone, which captures their soul upon death and redirects it into the Craftworld's infinity circuit, a vast psychic lattice that holds the spirits of all their ancestors. Their entire existence is a precarious balancing act to protect the living, but more importantly, protect the souls of the dead. The problem was Iyanden's ancient seers and farseers, their psychic leaders, were so obsessed with predicting the machinations of chaos, that ultimate spiritual enemy, that they had become completely blind to the material threat brewing right in front of them. While their powerful minds were busy scanning the warp for signs of demonic corruption, they entirely missed the black tide of organic horror, moving through the real universe toward them. When the Rangers, the Elder Scouts, finally reported the truth, the fear was immediate and absolute. The Kraken tendril aimed at them was so vast, so incredibly swift, that there was no way to run. This massive, world-eating swarm was impossible to outrun, and if they stayed, they were facing extinction. Their spiritual leader, Farseer Kelman Firesight, made a grim, heart-wrenching announcement: the Elder would have to unite every single soul and fight shoulder to stand even a glimmer of a chance. This led to a series of desperate measures, each more tragic than the last. First, they did the unthinkable. They awakened the avatar of Cain. Cain is the Elder's ancient, bloody-handed god of war, a primal force of murder and savagery. His essence was shattered millennia ago, and a shard of his white-hot soul now rests in the heart of every craftworld, sitting there, immobile, like an enormous figure of cold, black iron. To awaken him, the Elder must perform an ancient, terrible ritual, which requires one of their heroes, a chosen warrior called the Young King, to enter the Avatar's chamber. The Exarchs sing the hymns of war, the terrible scream echoes, and the Avatar rises, a terrifying, fiery giant with a molten lava core and a body made of superheated iron. But the Young King is never seen again, having been utterly consumed by the essence of the god. The Avatar's presence floods the surrounding warriors with savage bloodlust and courage, making them fearless, but the sacrifice is absolute. They needed this fiery, unthinking rage to face the Tyranids, but the price was a sacred life. But even a war god wasn't enough to build an army big enough. This brings us to the most tragic choice Iyanden made, and the source of their sad nickname, the Ghost Warriors. The Elder were simply too few in number. They had lost so many over the millennia that they could not muster enough living warriors, guardians and aspects, to fight the billion-strong Hive Fleet. So, Farseer Kelman gave the final, damning order: they would call upon the dead. They activated their spirit seers to pull the waystones, the soul gems, out of their sacred resting places in the infinity circuit, and placed them into giant, elegant war machines known as Wraith constructs, the massive Wraith Lords and the powerful Wraith Guard. Imagine that for a second. The Elder fought so desperately to protect their ancestors' souls from Slaanesh, only to force those souls into mechanical bodies to fight an unwinnable battle. The Craftworld's army became a host of ghost warriors, hulking psychic machines animated by the souls of the departed, the very souls they were meant to safeguard. Other Elder, when hearing of this, viewed it with open disdain, calling it angst-ridden necromancy. But for Iyanden, it was the only way to field an army capable of resisting the Great Devourer. They were forced to desecrate their own dead just to survive. The battle that followed was agony. The Tyranid bio-ships swarmed the massive Craftworld, wave after wave of horrific, genetically engineered monsters. The Tyranids didn't stop, and because Kraken had learned to adapt so quickly, each new attack was different from the last, constantly probing and exploiting the Elder defenses. The fight moved from space to the living halls and graceful corridors of Iyanden itself, becoming a horrifying, chaotic layer cake, where Elder and Tyranids fought level by level. their elegant architecture torn apart by claws and biocannon fire. The losses mounted quickly. Even the Elders' powerful sorcerers, the Warlocks and Farseers, were locked in ferocious, draining psychic duels with the specialized Tyranid bioforms like the zoanthropes. It was a pure war of attrition, and for a dying race attrition is simply a death sentence. The Eldar, including the Ghost Warriors and the newly awakened Avatar, were pushed back relentlessly. They were on the brink of complete annihilation. Then, at the very darkest moment, salvation came from the unlikeliest source, a pirate. A figure long banished from the Craftworld. The exiled Corsair Prince Ryle returned. Years before, he had been stripped of his title and command, forcing him into a life of piracy among the stars. But despite his banishment, he could not stand by and watch his home perish. He arrived with his own pirate fleet, the Eldritch Raiders, crashing through the Tyranid lines like a vengeful storm. Ryle was a brilliant naval commander, and teaming up with the shattered remnants of Iyanden's fleet, he conducted a series of daring, successful attacks against the largest Tyranid bioships, using hit-and-run tactics to break up the enemy's orbital cohesion. The defenders on the Craftworld, preparing to die, suddenly noticed a chilling, beautiful silence. No new waves of invaders were breaching the walls. Ryle had somehow broken the orbital siege. But the ground war continued. A final powerful Hive tyrant, likely a new intelligent manifestation of the Hive mind, was leading a frenzied mob of monsters toward the core of the Craftworld. All attempts to stop it were failing until Ryle himself descended to the surface. He took up the final, ultimate weapon of desperation, the Spear of Twilight. This was an ancient artifact of immense power, so potent that it didn't just kill the enemy, it was famously cursed, gradually burning out the life force and soul of its wielder. Ryle was willing to sacrifice his immortal soul just to buy his people a future. He rushed into the fray and, in a furious, desperate confrontation, used the cursed weapon to pierce the head of the mighty creature, finally bringing the Hive tyrant crashing to the ground. With the clear will of the Hive mind severed, the remaining Tyranids descended into a confused, feral pack, easily annihilated by the surviving Ghost Warriors. Iyanden was saved, but the victory felt like a crushing defeat. The Craftworld stood in ruins, its magnificent crystalline domes and intricate architecture ravaged. The final horrifying casualty count was devastating. 4/5, or 80%, of its entire population was dead or dying. The once largest Craftworld in the galaxy had been reduced to a fragile ghost ship, an artificial world populated mostly by the silent, walking dead who fought in the bodies of their ancestors. The human Imperium and the Elder had unknowingly fought the same enemy, an invisible alliance in a dark corner of the universe. The Kraken was broken, but the survival of Iyanden was a hollow, tragic reminder that the cost of winning against the Great Devourer was always astronomical. They had survived 2 full invasions, but the horror wasn't over. In fact, the next war was already beginning, and it would be the most terrifying one yet. You have to remember something crucial. The Hive mind learns faster than any other creature in the galaxy. It had already seen Hive Fleet Behemoth get smashed in one single mass at Macragge, and it saw Hive Fleet Kraken get scattered and defeated by clever tactics and preparation, even after it divided its forces. The Hive mind wasn't going to make the same mistake again. It was time for the ultimate invasion. Only 4 short years after the horrific, almost fatal victory at Craftworld Iyanden, the galaxy began to feel the first shivers of something monumental. Around the year 997 of the 42nd millennium, Inquisitor Kryptman, the same rogue hero who named the First Fleet, reported sighting a new cluster of Tyranid forces, a cluster of a size that made Behemoth look like a scouting party. He gave this colossal new wave the name Hive Fleet Leviathan, and everyone knew instantly that the Third Tyrannic War had begun. This time the Hive mind didn't just change its strategy, it changed its approach vector completely, introducing an element of utter surprise that shattered the Imperium's entire defense structure. For the first two wars, the Tyranids came in from the eastern fringe, the known edge of the galaxy, where the Imperium had its fleets and its defenses pointed. Everyone was looking east, right? But Leviathan, having learned from its predecessors' failures, executed a genius maneuver. It approached the Milky Way from an entirely new direction, from below the galactic plane. Imagine a massive black hole suddenly opening up beneath your feet. That's what this felt like. This movement completely bypassed the Imperium's traditional, millennia-old defensive lines, which were all arranged horizontally across the galactic plane. There was no warning, no slow build-up of contact reports. Leviathan simply erupted into the southern, central regions of the galaxy, the Segmentum Pacificus, with terrifying speed, instantly isolating dozens, if not hundreds of worlds that had no idea they were about to be devoured. The initial warning came from Kryptman, but the devastating psychic blanket of the shadow in the warp fell quickly, separating entire sectors from the human state and leaving them lost, like the worlds of Valador and Sate Capena, almost before anyone realized they were gone. Leviathan was not only the largest hive fleet ever encountered, it was the ultimate evolved Tyranid threat. It had assimilated the best traits of its predecessors, the crushing force of Behemoth, the distributed speed and cunning of Kraken, and combined them into a multi-pronged, relentless assault. It wasn't just a wave, it was a cosmic hurricane, capable of hitting major, vital worlds while simultaneously sneaking smaller, deadly tendrils deep into the heart of the Imperium. The scale of this new threat was so vast, so overwhelming, that it immediately forced the Imperium into the most desperate military operation in its long history, total triage. With the enemy swarming and cutting off vast portions of the galaxy, the Imperial Navy had to make excruciating choices: which planets were strategically important enough to save, and which had to be sacrificed. And this brings us to the first major, horrifying flashpoint of the Leviathan War, Tarsis Ultra. Tarsis Ultra was not a military base like Macragge. It was an incredibly important, prosperous manufacturing world, a forge world in all but name, that produced a huge range of products and was absolutely vital to the Imperium's economy in that sector. If the Tyranids devoured it, they would not only gain untold amounts of biomass, but they would also cripple the Imperial war machine's ability to replenish its forces. The defense was quickly organized, involving the Ultramarines, led by Captain Uriel Ventris, along with Deathwatch kill teams and local Imperial Guardsmen regiments. But the Hive Fleet was already in the system, and before they could even finish preparations, the Tyranids claimed their first victim, a small mining world called Barbarous First. The Imperial fleet, commanded by Ventris and Admiral Tiberius, arrived just in time to witness the tragedy unfold. The world, inhabited by a mere 9,000 miners, had fallen in a matter of hours, lacking any strong defenses. The Tyranids, having devoured the entire planet down to the subsoil, were busy feasting on the spoils of war. Ventris, in a fit of righteous fury, ordered an immediate, revenge-fueled counter-attack against the feasting horde. That first clash in space was a disaster. The Imperial fleet suffered significant losses, unable to make a dent in the quickly reorganizing Tyranid swarm. The first battle for the system was a failure, and Ventris knew they had to find a new strategy or face annihilation. It was at this point that the central conflict of the Third War truly emerged. A conflict not just against the Xenos, but within the Imperium itself. The command team was split into two camps over the next vital planet in the system, the manufacturing world of Cordelia. Captain Ventris, supported by his naval allies, argued for a continued, desperate effort to evacuate the 16 million citizens still on Cordelia, even at the cost of major fleet losses. They were holding out hope, prioritizing human lives. But the second camp, led by the infamous Inquisitor Kryptman, argued for the brutal, cold, and immediate alternative exterminatus. Kryptman, now a veteran of 2 wars and branded an outcast by his own colleagues for his increasingly radical methods, saw the moral debate as a weakness that would doom the entire sector. Why risk the entire defense fleet? And why let the hive mind gain a single ton of precious biomass, when you could sterilize the world and deny them the meal? Kryptman argued that Ventress's plan of hoping for a last-minute evacuation was putting the entire combined fleet at risk and giving the Tyranids an unacceptable resource boost. The argument was fierce, almost coming to blows between Ventress and the more radical Space Marine allies of Kryptman, until they were calmed by Admiral Tiberius. They eventually settled on a compromise: lure the Tyranids into a devastating trap using one of the system's hydrogen plasma factories as a massive improvised bomb. This plan was executed perfectly, obliterating hundreds of Tyranid vessels in a fiery lie. The Imperial forces cheered, thinking they had won a massive tactical victory, but the celebration lasted less than an hour. Kryptman, unwilling to trust a compromise, used a ship manned by his allies to bomb Cordelia with viral weapons, instantly annihilating all organic life, including the remaining population, to ensure the Hive fleet gained nothing. It was a devastating, genocidal act, but it achieved Kryptman's goal. Cordelia was sterilized, a dead rock denying Leviathan its meal. The Imperial forces retreated to the last defensive line on Tarsis Ultra itself, now fighting an enemy that was not only massive and smart, but that they had now personally starved and angered. This desperate battle would culminate in a final, audacious plan. Realizing they could never defeat the Leviathan forces through conventional combat, the Imperium decided to target the heart of the entire fleet. The Imperial forces developed a biological poison specifically designed to strike at the Hive Mind's command core, the Norn Queen, the living center of the fleet's will and direction. This was the only hope, but it required a suicide mission. An elite Deathwatch strike team, supported by Captain Ventress, had to physically break through the orbital siege, land a small shuttle, breach the hull of a massive Hive ship, and inject the bioweapon directly into the Norn Queen's core. The entire remaining Imperial fleet, led by the heavily damaged remnants of the Navy, sacrificed themselves to create a tiny breach, a desperate corridor for the small strike team to pass through. Against all odds, the team succeeded. The moment the poison was injected, the heart of the Hive fleet shattered. The Hive Mind's control was instantly lost, and the millions of Tyranids swarming the planet lost cohesion, devolving into feral, panicked beasts that turned on one another. Tarsis Ultra survived, saved by a suicidal military tactic and a political decision that cost billions of lives in a ruthless, Scorched Earth strategy. While a tactical victory, Tarsis Ultra was just the prologue. Only one tendril of the monster Leviathan had been clipped. The great beast was still alive, still hungry, and still headed toward the greatest, most important target of the entire war, the home world of the Blood Angels, Baal. We just survived the devastating Hive Fleet Kraken, which was beaten only because the legendary Marnius Calga learned to fight smart, and because the Elder Blood themselves dry fighting with the souls of their dead. But the cruel reality of the Great Devourer is that it doesn't take a long coffee break. It immediately analyzed its failures and sent a message back into the intergalactic void. Send the biggest one yet. And that, my friends, is how the galaxy was slammed by Hive Fleet Leviathan, the largest, hungriest, and most cunning Tyranid fleet we have ever seen. The scale of the crisis was immediate. Since Leviathan attacked from below the galactic plane, bypassing all established defenses, the Imperium was instantly caught with its pants around its ankles. Dozens of worlds were already being devoured before Central Command even realized what was happening, creating a strategic nightmare that demanded a solution faster than a battle barge could jump through the warp. And this is where our tragic hero, Inquisitor Kryptman, steps back onto the stage. Kryptman, now a grizzled veteran of 2 previous wars, was hardened by the horror he had witnessed: the stripped-bare rock of Tyran Prime, the annihilation of the Ultramarines First Company. He knew that conventional tactics defend, retreat, counter-attack, simply fed the monster. When you fight the Tyranids, you are fighting a biological imperative to consume. So Kryptman decided to deny them the meal. He proposed a strategy so ruthless, so chillingly logical, that it immediately got him branded as a genocidal maniac by his peers and an enemy of the human state, Scorched Earth. Kryptman ordered the entire Imperial Navy to start subjecting every planet in Leviathan's projected path to exterminatus, the complete, cleansing destruction of all life. This wasn't a tactical retreat. It was a preemptive genocide. Imagine a fleet of warships arriving in orbit, not to defend you, but to obliterate you and your entire world with cyclonic torpedoes and viral bombs, leaving nothing behind but a molten starer. The idea was to create a gigantic, galaxy-spanning firebreak, a moat of dead worlds that Leviathan could not cross because it had no biomass to consume, forcing the Hive Fleet to starve or divert. Kryptman was signing the death warrant for hundreds of worlds, sacrificing billions of innocent lives. The scale of this self-inflicted slaughter was so vast it hadn't been seen since the horrific civil war that nearly destroyed the Imperium 10,000 years ago, the Horus Heresy. The political response was exactly what you'd expect. Kryptman was denounced by the Inquisition as a fool and a radical, stripped of his rank and authority, and declared excommunicate traitoris, a traitor to the Imperium. They told him to stop his slaughter immediately, but Kryptman didn't care. He was already far out in the galaxy, a rogue agent of his own terrible conscience. He famously believed that the cost of sacrificing millions of lives was justified if it meant saving billions more from being consumed by the Great Devourer. He believed he was saving the Imperium by doing the one thing no one else had the cold heart to do. But Kryptman was not satisfied with just denying the enemy a meal. He had an even more audacious plan. If he couldn't destroy the Tyranids, he would weaponize them against a different, equally terrifying foe. He decided to use the endless, unquenchable hunger of Hive Fleet Leviathan to solve one of the Imperium's other huge, bleeding strategic problems. His target, the terrifying green-skinned race known as the Orcs. The Orcs are not like other species. They are less like animals and more like a combination of animal and fungus, literally engineered eons ago to be the ultimate warriors. They don't fight for resources or political power. They are driven by a singular, primal ecstasy for combat known as the Warg. They are a biological engine of constant warfare, and the Orcs in the massive Octarius Empire were running wild, creating a perpetual war zone that had consumed countless imperial resources without any sign of victory. Kryptman's strategy, later dubbed the Kryptman Gambit, was chillingly simple: pit the ultimate consumers, the Tyranids, against the ultimate warriors, the Orcs, and hope they would mutually annihilate each other, solving two enormous problems with one terrible throw of the dice. This required incredible suicidal preparation. Kryptman needed a lure, something strong enough to redirect an entire tendril of the gargantuan Hive Fleet. He chose the Genestealers, the vanguard invaders who act as the psychic scouts for the swarm. After a brutal, costly mission that saw the death of some of the elite Deathwatch Space Marines loyal to Kryptman, a brood of the terrifying Genestealers was captured alive. Kryptman then loaded these captured creatures, held in psychic stasis fields, onto a Space Hulk, a massive, derelict ship drifting through the warp, and carefully altered its course. The Genestealers, with their powerful, specialized psychic link to the hive mind, acted like a massive, biological tracking beacon, an irresistible scent of fresh prey. The nearest tendril of Leviathan immediately altered its course, drawn by the new promising signal, and began its terrifying plunge straight into the heart of the Orc Empire of Octarius. The plan was audacious, brilliant, and as history now shows, a complete and utter catastrophe. At first, everything seemed to be going perfectly. The two colossal forces clashed, and the resulting Octarius War became a theater of destruction unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. A glorious, bloody mess of chitin and green skin, The orcs, whose biology thrives on combat, found themselves in absolute paradise. They grew bigger, stronger, and meaner, fueled by endless battle, which only increased their warg energy. They literally became super orcs thanks to the constant bloodshed. And the Tyranids. They found an inexhaustible, self-replenishing supply of biomass. They didn't just consume the orcs, they consumed the orcs' genetic material, evolving new creatures and refining their tactics to counter the orcs' incredible resilience. The Octarius War created a terrifying, self-perpetuating engine of destruction, a rapid-fire, perpetual arms race where the only winner was the concept of violence itself. Kryptman's cunning gamble didn't result in mutual annihilation, it resulted in evolutionary acceleration for both of the galaxy's most destructive races. The horrifying climax of the Octarius War saw the Hive Fleet Leviathan finally emerge victorious, having consumed the entire system and gained unimaginable power and bio-knowledge from the brutal conflict. The defeated, super-tough orc forces weren't killed off, they were simply pushed out by the billion, fleeing the system only to crash headlong into the nearest Imperial worlds. The problem had not been solved. It had merely been amplified and redirected straight back at the Imperium that Kryptman had tried so desperately to save. In the end, Kryptman's gambit was a downright epic fail. The rogue Inquisitor, with his cold, ruthless pragmatism, had only succeeded in creating a far stronger monster than the one he started with. But even this terrifying failure was only a sideshow to the main event, because while Kryptman's gamble was playing out, the largest, most critical tendril of Leviathan was closing in on its final, mythic target, the ancient home of the Blood Angels, the desolate planet of Baal. Okay, so we left off with Inquisitor Kryptman's Scorched Earth policy and his reckless galaxy-bending gamble in Octarius, both of which resulted in a bigger, angrier Tyranid horde. The truth is, that whole grim chapter, the sacrifice of billions, the excommunication of Kryptman, all bought time for just one crucial defensive line, the industrial world of Tarsis Ultra. This wasn't just another planet. Tarsis Ultra was a vital cog in the Imperium's war machine, a major source of manufacturing and specialized technology. If Leviathan devoured this world, the Imperium's ability to wage the next war would be completely crippled. So, the defense here was not optional, it was the entire Imperium holding its breath. The Imperial forces defending the world knew they were the last barrier for this tendril of Hive Fleet Leviathan. Their command structure was a desperate, multi-faction effort. The elite Ultramarines, commanded by the brilliant Captain Uriel Ventris, hardened veterans of the Death Watch, the Imperium's alien hunting specialists, and massive regiments of the local Imperial Guard, the Astra Militarum. Now let's be real about the Imperial Guard here. They were numerous, a massive, sprawling defense force, but most of them were local regiments, meaning they were almost entirely inexperienced in fighting an actual, organized Tyranid invasion. They were great at fighting internal rebellions or maybe fending off a few stray orcs, but facing Leviathan, they were terrified, unprepared, and their morale was fragile. It was a terrifying reality. The bulk of the planet's defense rested on men and women who had never seen anything like the endless, chitinous waves crashing over their defenses. The Ultramarines and the Death Watch were the hardened core, but they were surrounded by fear and inexperience. The battle was immediately a nightmare of attrition. The hive mind, having been starved by Kryptman's desperate Scorched Earth campaign, was utterly furious and totally relentless. They didn't just attack. They poured endless millions of creatures onto the planet, from the massive carnifexes, the living battering rams, to the countless hordes of gaunts meant to chew up ammunition and exhaust the defenders. The Tyranids learned from every failed charge, adjusting their vectors, evolving new defensive layers, and constantly striking at the weakest points of the Imperial lines. Captain Ventris, a sharp military mind who later learned the price of Kryptman's Scorched Earth strategy firsthand, realized something critical as the battle ground on. They couldn't win this through conventional combat. The numbers were simply too great, and even with the heroic efforts of the Space Marines, it was only a matter of time before the endless tide of biological horror overwhelmed them. The hive mind was a single, unified consciousness, and as long as that mind existed, the torrent of bodies would never stop flowing. So, they needed a solution that was as radical and brutal as Kryptman's own actions, but one that would actually destroy the monster, not just redirect it. The scientists and technicians of the Defense Force, working under extreme duress in bunkers deep beneath the besieged city, came up with a final, desperate, suicidal plan. Their only hope was a hyper-specialized biological poison, a bioweapon designed not to kill the average bug, but to strike directly at the core of the entire Hive Fleet's consciousness. This target wasn't the Swarm Lord. They had killed that creature before, and it always regenerated, simply being reborn somewhere else. The target was the Norn Queen, the massive, immobile, living core of the fleet, the central biological factory and command center, where the hive mind's will was physically focused. The Norn Queen is literally the fleet's living core, the brain of the monster. Destroying it would be like instantly severing the spinal cord of the entire invasion tendril. This set the stage for one of the most daring, foolhardy missions of the entire Tyrannic Wars. The plan was simple: the remnants of the Imperial Navy, which had been badly mauled but not destroyed, would have to sacrifice themselves entirely to create a tiny, momentary breach in the Tyranid orbital blockade. Through that breach, a single, small shuttle carrying an elite Deathwatch kill team, the best alien hunters in the galaxy, would have to slip past the Tyranid defenses, somehow land on the gargantuan, kilometer-long organic hull of a hive ship, and breach its biological shell. Then, fighting through the horrors of the ship's internal, biological corridors, the very veins and arteries of the beast, they had to find the central chamber and inject the poison into the Norn Queen. It was a suicide mission in every sense of the word. Every step meant near certain death. The fleet, commanded by Admiral Tiberius, flew straight into the heart of the Void Siege, trading their lives for a few precious minutes. They created the gap, and the small transport carrying Ventress and the Deathwatch plunged into the hellish blackness of the bio ship's hangar bay. The team fought through the horrors of the living vessel, pushing deep into the dark, pulsating alien heart of the creature. Finally, they reached the chamber, found the horrifying, mountainous Norn Queen, and successfully delivered the biological payload. The result was immediate and catastrophic for the hive mind. The instant the specialized poison was injected, the entire consciousness of the hive fleet shattered. Imagine you are a cell in a body, and suddenly the brain just disappears. The will of the hive mind was gone. The creatures attacking Tarsis Ultra, which moments before had been a perfectly synchronized military machine, devolved instantly. They lost all cohesion, all purpose, and most terrifyingly, their basic, animalistic hunger and aggression turned on the nearest living thing, which happened to be other Tyranids. On the planet below, the Imperial defenders witnessed a miracle. The relentless, focused attack suddenly dissolved into a chaotic, monstrous civil war. Gaunts tore at warriors. Carnifexes smashed their way through their own hordes, and the entire invasion force devolved into a frenzied, panicked pack of beasts, fighting each other until they were either destroyed or cut down by the stunned, relieved Imperial Guard. Tarsis Ultra survived. It was a stunning, desperate, hard-won victory, a perfect example of how the hive mind's strength, its singular consciousness, was also its greatest weakness. But just like Macragge and Iyanden before it, Tarsis Ultra emerged from the conflict scarred and forever changed, a testament to the price of survival. They had stopped one tendril of Leviathan, but they knew this massive hive fleet was still out there, learning from this failure and getting ready to aim its next, more devastating blow at the most symbolic target in the Imperium. The real war, the final test, was still to come, and that target was the ancestral home of the Blood Angels. The successful but tragically costly victory at Tarsis Ultra was merely the end of one scene in a horrifying galaxy-spanning play. The largest, hungriest tendril of Hive Fleet Leviathan, the one Kryptman couldn't starve or redirect, was still out there, its destination locked on one specific, sacred, and surprisingly desolate star cluster Baal. Baal is not some rich, luscious agri world brimming with delicious biomass. It's a harsh, sun-scorched, dusty rock, the ancestral homeworld of the Blood Angel Space Marine chapter and its moons, Baal Prime and Baal Secundus. Why would the ultimate consumers target a desert world? The reasons are known only to the hive mind, but for the Blood Angels this was the end of the line. Their chapter master, the millennia-old Commander Dante, knew that they were about to face total extinction, but he was not about to surrender the birthplace of his lineage without a final, glorious, world-shattering fight. The terrifying reality facing the Blood Angels is that they don't just fight the Great Devourer, they are constantly fighting themselves. This is the story of the flawed. Every single Blood Angel Space Marine carries a terrible, genetic curse derived from the psychic death of their revered Primarch Sanguinius thousands of years ago. The flaw manifests in two insidious ways, the red thirst and the black rage. The red thirst is a short-lived, physical horror, a battle frenzy that makes the Marines literally hungry for blood and causes them to lose control. They develop fangs, their muscles bulge hideously, and they are gripped by an unholy need to drink the vital fluids of their enemies. It's a temporary madness, but one that fills them with savage aggression, and can sometimes turn them into a danger to their own allies or civilians. Dante, like all his predecessors, spent centuries desperately trying to suppress this shameful, monstrous urge in his sons. The Black Rage, however, is final. When a Blood Angel falls to the Black Rage, they are plunged into a permanent, incurable psychic darkness. They stop seeing the present battle entirely. Instead, they are forced to ceaselessly relive the final, agonizing moments of their Primarch, Sanguinius, fighting against the traitor Horus aboard the War Master's flagship. They believe they are Sanguinius, surrounded by the enemy, and they want to kill every single person they see, perceiving them all as the arch-traitor. There is no recovery from this final madness. Warriors who succumb to the Black Rage on the eve of battle are immediately clad in black armor and formed into the Death Company. A screaming, frenzied mob of glorious killers who are led by chaplains to seek an immediate, honorable death on the front lines. But what about those who fall permanently to the red thirst? Those whose genetic mutation has made them into physical monsters. This brings us to the Tower of Amerio, also known as the Tower of the Lost. This hidden, secret fortress on Baal was where the Blood Angels locked away the horrifying results of the flaw. Those space marines who had completely succumbed to the red thirst and mutated into something monstrous, physically unrecognizable and screaming endlessly for blood. They were the chapter's deep, dark secret, living manifestations of their shame, sealed away so the rest of the Imperium would never know the truth. But as Leviathan approached, Dante, the millennia-old master, knew he had to do the unthinkable to buy his people time. Following the brutal logic of Kryptman, Dante used the last of his ships and resources to subject over 30 worlds in the path of the Tyranid fleet to exterminate us. This shocking act of self-genocide bought the Blood Angels precious days to gather every single one of their successor chapters, the Flesh-Tearers, the Blood Drinkers, the Lamenters, and more, and consolidate their defenses on Baal and its two moons. The space battle was a terrifying repeat of Macragge, only this time the Blood Angels had less. Their combined fleet was hopelessly outnumbered, fighting with an almost joyful ferocity, but dozens, then hundreds, of massive Tyranid bioships simply overwhelmed them. Imperial vessels were torn to shreds, and their formation was scattered. But even as the last flares of their navy died in the black sky, the Blood Angels fought on, falling back to the ground defenses. The defense on Baal began ingeniously. Dante had ordered the construction of massive trenches and defensive lines filled with a horrifying substance called thirst water, a liquid that instantly sucked the moisture out of any organic matter it touched. The first mass attacks of the Tyranids were drowned in this gruesome slurry, but the hive mind adapted quickly, sacrificing tens of thousands of its lesser forms, the hormagaunts and termagants, to pile up a literal crossing of dead bodies so the waves behind them could advance. The Tyranids pressed inward, pushing the defenders toward the ultimate, final sanctuary, the walls of the great fortress monastery, the Arx Angelicum. For a time, the massive void shields, ancient, powerful energy barriers, held back the relentless alien assault. Dante briefly thought they might actually win this war of attrition. But the hive mind knew where to strike. It slipped a deadly assassin creature, a lictor deep into the fortress's underbelly. Guided by the collective consciousness, the creature found the central shield generator and destroyed it, causing the entire energy defense system to collapse instantly. With the void shields gone, the final line was breached. The Tyranids poured in, and Dante realized he had run out of time and options. He stood before the remnants of his great host, gathered for the final, hopeless charge. He knew the enemy was regrouping, preparing the final, decisive blow. He had only two weapons left, the absolute loyalty of his remaining warriors, and his terrible dark secret. And then Commander Dante gave the order to open the Tower of Amerio. The creatures that surged out were not the organized black-armored Death Company, but the gene-seed abominations. Monsters twice the size of a space marine, with hideous bulging muscles, skin stretched taut, and the savage glint of amber eyes. They were the living shame of the Blood Angels, the true monsters they hid from the galaxy, and Dante ordered them to be unleashed as a berserk, final wave. Following the mutated, screaming monsters of the Tower of the Lost, the entire remaining Blood Angels host, including the Death Company, charged out into the Tyranid horde. Dante's goal was simple: force a breakthrough, reach the central synapse creature, likely another manifestation of the Swarm Lord, and kill it to cause immediate chaos. He knew he was sending his sons to certain death, but their sacrifice was meant to save the entire sector, not just the planet. The battle was a massacre. Dante himself tore through the throngs of monsters, engaged in a brutal, unequal duel with the terrifying Hive Tyrant, finally managing to deal a mortal blow to the creature, but suffering grievous injuries in the process. The Hive Tyrant was dead, and the momentary victory had been won at the cost of the chapter's entire fighting strength. They were about to be annihilated. The Tyranids, though scattered, still vastly outnumbered them, preparing to finish the slaughter. But then the galaxy itself intervened. Hundreds of thousands of light years away, the imperial fortress world of Cadia fell, and in that cataclysmic event the galaxy was ripped apart by the Great Rift, a massive, galaxy-spanning warp storm. This violent surge of psychic energy acted like an electromagnetic pulse on a cosmic scale, tearing through the psychic consciousness of the hive mind. On Baal, the effect was immediate and stunning. The connection between the billions of Tyranid organisms was suddenly severed. The perfectly coordinated army dissolved instantly into a confused, panicked pack of wild beasts. The feral, hungry Tyranids began attacking the nearest living thing, which was often other Tyranids. The Blood Angels were given a miraculous 5-day reprieve while the entire Hive fleet descended into a horrifying frenzy of claws and teeth. The war was won not by their strength, but by pure, catastrophic chance. The chaos was eventually brought to an end when the newly resurrected Primarch Robert Guilliman, the genetic father of the Ultramarines, arrived with the vanguard of his colossal Indomitus Crusade fleet, ready to cleanse the remnants of the broken Hive fleet and save the last of the Blood Angels. The Third Tyrannic War was over. Baal survived, but its civilization was devastated, and the Blood Angels were crippled, forced to confront the terrible truth of their survival. Commander Dante, having lived through the annihilation of his chapter, was immediately appointed the Lord Regent of Imperium Nihilus, the entire half of the galaxy now consumed by the Great Rift, a grim reward for his courage and sacrifice. The cost of victory was incalculable, and the biggest problem still loomed. The main, monolithic force of Leviathan was still out there. They had only defeated a small, defeated tendril. The victory at Baal, the one we just talked about, was nothing but a desperate, catastrophic fluke. We survived the devastation of Baal thanks only to a psychic accident, the Great Rift, tearing the hive mind's consciousness in half for a few days. But that brief respite, that tiny window of hope, was a lie. It was a tactical deception on a galactic scale. The Blood Angels had defeated a major tendril of Hive Fleet Leviathan, but Imperial intelligence quickly confirmed a terrifying truth: that tendril was only the vanguard. The true Leviathan, the monolithic, multi-pronged main body of the fleet, was still out there lurking in the blackness, and now it had finally arrived. This, my friends, is the beginning of the Fourth Tyrannic War, the current, most brutal, and most existential chapter in this endless conflict. The scale of this new invasion is unprecedented. Leviathan has emerged from the depths below the galactic plane, swarming the entire galactic west, striking against hundreds of worlds simultaneously. The Imperium, reeling from the colossal civil war brought on by the Great Rift, and locked in battles against chaos on the other side of the galaxy, was completely exposed. Their main battle fleets were busy fighting other, equally terrifying enemies, and they couldn't mobilize the slow, lumbering, millennia-old war machine in time. Dozens of vital systems were instantly isolated and devoured before anyone in Central Command even realized they were under attack. The problem facing the Imperium was simple. How do you stop a monster that learns faster than you can build? How do you fight back when your enemy has had centuries to analyze every single weakness you've ever shown? The answer came not from massive armies, but from small, rapid elite strikes. In a desperate, last-minute move, the Imperium forged a new type of task force, the Solar Blades or Soblades. These aren't huge legions or battle barges. They are small, autonomous, incredibly fast-moving reaction fleets, packed with the best of the Imperial Guard, the Imperial Navy, and the Space Marines. Their purpose is not to win the war, but to bleed the Hive and buy time, carving minutes from extinction while the rest of the Imperium plays catch-up. Their strategy is pure guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run tactics, focusing entirely on taking out the critical synapse creatures to disrupt the hive mind's command and cause momentary chaos. The Solar Blades found success, but the horrifying part is that the hive mind was watching them. Every victory the Imperium achieved on Tarsis Ultra, every heroic last stand by the Ultramarines, every clever feint, all of it was devoured and processed by the hive mind, which realized one terrifying truth: its biggest tactical problem wasn't a shortage of bodies, it was the persistent, unpredictable intervention of Imperial heroes. So, the hive mind evolved. It birthed entirely new, specialized bioforms designed specifically to counter the Imperium's greatest asset, its exceptional commanders and soldiers. First up is the chilling Norn emissary. Forget the Swarmlord, which was mostly an intelligent general. The Norn emissary is an ultimate hero killer. It's a massive, terrifyingly agile bioform, bigger and nastier than even the already huge Hive Tyrant, specifically engineered by the Norn Queen herself to hunt down and assassinate gifted Imperial commanders, or to abduct highly knowledgeable prey from the most heavily fortified strongholds. We're talking about a monster so powerful it can rip through an elite squad of the Emperor's bodyguards, the Adeptus Custodes, with unsettling ease. Its entire purpose is to nullify the impact of the pivotal individuals, the very heroes who keep the Imperium from collapsing. The hive mind has essentially engineered a specialized, biological assassin to take out Manius Calgar and Commander Dante, neutralizing the Imperium's biggest advantage. Then there's the existential horror of the psychophage. The hive mind also understood the threat posed by powerful Imperial psychers. the librarians and sorcerers, who can channel the forces of the warp to fight back. The psychophage is a fearsome, specialized creature with an insatiable appetite for those with psychic potential. It's designed to dismantle them with its razor-sharp talons, and even more disgustingly, unleash a repugnant discharge of psycho-corrosive ash that liquefies the brains of its targets, providing more raw psychic material for the hive mind to absorb. It's a literal predator for the very minds of the Imperium's most dangerous wizards. And the entire synaptic network has been improved. New creatures like the Neurotorrent and the tiny Neurogonts are now on the field. The Neurotorrent focuses and channels the terrifying psychic dread of the shadow in the warp, making the enemy feel even more paralyzed and susceptible to the horror. It acts like a superior psychic router, extending the synaptic link to creatures that have strayed far from the main leader, ensuring that fewer bugs go feral, and the entire swarm maintains perfect, ruthless coordination across vast distances. Even the classic Tyranid vanguard has evolved. We're seeing creatures like von Ryan's Leapers, stealthy, multi-limbed assassins named after the Imperial agent who first stumbled across their gruesome work. These things stalk the shadows, slipping through enemy lines to kill officers and sabotage defenses before the main attack even hits. The war is now an escalating arms race between biological evolution and desperate military ingenuity. This entire conflict has recently centered on one pivotal world, Sanctum. Sanctum is the linchpin world, the headquarters for the entire Imperial defense in the Segmentum Pacificus. If Sanctum falls, the entire sector falls, and the road to the sacred core of the Imperium is open for Leviathan. Desperate to hold this one crucial world, Imperial Command has been forced to pull the successful solar blades back from other, less vital sectors, leaving two major tendrils of Leviathan completely unattended and free to continue their destructive advance towards Holy Terror itself. And to compound the horror of the siege, Imperial intelligence has detected the ominous arrival of the next, unimaginable escalation. A gargantuan, organic entity, a moon-sized bioweapon, is slowly approaching the Sanctum system. Nobody knows what this massive entity is. Is it a central brain? Is it a planet-eating weapon? Is it a colossal, city-sized bioship that eclipses all that came before? Whatever it is, it represents the ultimate threat, a final world-breaking weapon that signals the hive mind is tired of playing games. The Fourth Tyrannic War rages on. Every victory has cost humanity a terrible, incalculable price, and every new battle has been met by a new, more lethal evolution from the hive mind. The sheer scale of Leviathan has finally pushed the Imperium to the brink, forcing impossible choices and creating an escalating cycle of violence that shows no end. The grim truth of the 41st millennium remains: the war will not end until one side has completely consumed or annihilated the other. And right now, the ultimate devourer is only getting hungrier.